Good morning, everyone. I am Ibrahim Sundiata, Emeritus Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University, ex-chair of History at Howard University, and a former fellow at the Du Bois Institute at Harvard University. I want to talk to you about the film, the Netflix series that came out, Queen Cleopatra. An interesting work starring Adele James, a British actress, and produced by Jada Pinkett Smith. It's raised quite a bit of controversy, and it shows how confused Americans, especially, can be about race. Race enters almost everything we discuss, and so now we have an argument about race involving people who lived 2,000 years ago in a different place, when there was no United States, when there was no Dixie. And the kind of argument that Americans have about race would have been irrelevant. But I think that Queen Cleopatra, the series, brings up some very important questions. For instance, the question is, was Cleopatra black? And my answer would be no, she wasn't black. And when you start arguing that Cleopatra was black and that her court was black and that all her family was black, going all the way back to 332 BC, that is phony. It's fake news. Fake news. At the same time, when you argue, well, what was the race of the ancient Egyptians? The ancient Egyptians were black. The ancient Egyptians were black. I'll say it one more time. The ancient Egyptians were black. Now, why this seeming contradiction? Well, one of the things is that Cleopatra was the end of a dynasty, the Ptolemies. And the Ptolemies came from Macedonia, northern Greece. And they came after Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt. They came in as exploiters. They came in as one of a long list of exploiters. And if someone who did the series had consulted Egyptians, certain Egyptians, maybe even official Egyptians, they would be aware that Gamal Abdul Nasser, and many Egyptian nationalists pointed out in the revolution of 1952 that after 2,000 years, Egyptians were masters in their own house, and that ancient Egypt had crumbled by Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Turks. And they had always, that the real Egyptians, that is, the people who raised the wheat, who lived along the Nile, who lived in little mud houses, they had been imposed upon by foreign imperialists, ending with the British, for millennia, for thousands of years. And at last they were throwing off the shackles. And Cleopatra and her crowd were just another bunch of exploiters from outside. They lived in Alexandria, which in ancient Greek was called Alexandria by Egypt, not Alexandria in Egypt. The population spoke Greek. The city had the world's largest, let's say in one Common Era, 1 AD, the city had the largest Jewish population in the world. Most of the high culture, the library, etc., was written in Greek. And its ties to the still going out to the Mediterranean, to Rome, and to Greece. So here we are with this kind of complex. It's not that complex if you just go with what Egyptians were saying, radical Egyptians. Everyone came in here and took us over and exploited us and shipped out our products and gave us nothing. And they give a long list. Cleopatra's on the list, not on the list of the oppressed natives, but on the list of foreign oppressors. So that you get this crazy story in which it seems like all the Ptolemies, this Greek family, was African. And I keep talking about trying to insert Cleopatra in a list of African queens, and I assume that sooner or later they're going to shoot in Nzinga. of Angola. Hmm? But why this confusion? Well, the confusion deals with American racism and the American construction of race. So the US has a bizarre construction of race, which it began developing in the late 19th century in the post Reconstruction period, and grew and grew and grew and entered the national census in the 1930s. No other country has it. The US has it, but is afraid to apply it overseas. I'll give you an example. In the United States, any African ancestor, anytime, anywhere, could be 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, they are Black. They are Black. So if someone discovers that someone had an African ancestor in 1492 or 1500 or 1702 in the United States, supposedly that person is Black, which would make the youngest billionaire in the world, the Duke of Westminster, Black. His great, 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 great grandfather in the 17th century was Pushkin, General Pushkin, the grandfather of Alexander Pushkin, the poet. Now, no one probably would say, but people would say that's kind of stupid, that this very rich, very posh Englishman, who's very young and very rich, is Black. Well, in the United States, in theory, that's true. So we get, people who say they have one ancestor or one relative or one parent or one grandparent. It doesn't work like that. And Americans, including American racists, knew this. So they would call a man who looked one way, let's say reddish brown, a reddish brown man in Memphis, Tennessee. A reddish brown man in Memphis, Tennessee was a Negro. To discover the remains of the same man, the same type, and if we had any skin, which we usually don't, but that same man would have been Hamitic or white or Caucasian in Egypt. So one thing alive, one thing dead. And Du Bois pointed this out, and he complained about it. He said, it is a kind of neurosis that white Americans have about the ethnicity or race of the ancient Egyptians. He said, we cannot, if we are sane, divide the world into whites, yellows, and blacks, and then call blacks white. He meant if you divide the world up and you don't have any wiggle room, there's no intermediate group, then definitely the ancient Egyptians were Black. They're not the other groups. Well, one can say that, but since they can't talk and they've been dead for millennia, for thousands of years, we get into a kind of double counting. Now, in 2011, to test this out, and the results are conclusive, but strange, I was not on a research trip. In 2011, I visited Egypt, and I stayed with some very nice people. Very nice people took me around and had a party for me, and etc. And these were very pale people, paler than I. So if I don't have photographs, etc. And they were Egyptians. But my hostess, one of them, was who was very pale, was a descendant of Circassians. She was a descendant of Mamluks. She was a descendant of white slaves who had been brought in as military people in the previous centuries. The other people I met looked more like me. In fact, one day, being brave with my graduate school Arabic somehow retrieved, I wandered around central Cairo. I met a lot of people who looked like me, who were Egyptians. And people kept asking me for directions or what time it was, etc. My only bit of panic was when I had to ask for a cab back to the place I was staying, but I managed. I'm here. And people didn't seem to, what registered in, not that I was a foreigner until I spoke, but that I was not that much of a duck out of water. And I remember reading a very esteemed classicist / Egyptologist, Glenn Bowerstock. And he said only a very ignorant person would say that Egypt had anything to do with Africa, except in a geographical sense. Now, and not to be ad hominem, But I assume that if I paid for Mr. Bowerstock and myself to visit Egypt side by side, and we went up and down the Nile, all the way to Asyut in the south, one of us would seem much more Egyptian than the other. It's fact. And there's something pathetic in a kind of mottled pink person desperately seeking to have roots in North Africa. Sad. You're not part of the story. But a story is a story of power. Who writes the narrative? Well, now with planes, etc., we get a kind of confusion. We have African Americans going to Egypt. We have some Egyptians saying we look like you. And then we have a group of sort of aging Egyptologists saying, well, no, stop. And the sort of default position is, well, does it really matter? Does it really matter what race they were? Well, we wouldn't have these long and tendentious discussions if it didn't matter. If it didn't matter, I'd say, well, they were black. If race didn't matter. But we have very long and convoluted discussions. Now, I was in a near riot many years ago, way back in the 1990s, mid-1990s, at Wellesley College. And I was invited to be on a panel with that included Mary Lefkowitz, the classicist from Wellesley, and Hugh Rogers, another ancient historian. And Professor Lefkowitz was very concerned that young black students were getting all hyped up on Afrocentrism, and especially the theory that ancient Egypt, two things. Ancient Egypt gave the West its culture, its ideas of philosophy. It was the beginning of everything. So everything went back to Egypt. And she was very distressed by this. She was also more distressed by the fact that some Afrocentrists had argued that Egypt taught the Greeks everything they. And so she took on the question of Cleopatra, and she said, we know about all of Cleopatra's ancestors except one. And this is where there was some wiggle room, because some African Americans said, well, we don't know about the one, and so she could have been black, which in the United States would make her black. But the point is, in most of the world, that would not make her so. You have this long family history, long genealogy, and say, well, there was one person. Well, one person doesn't do it in most parts of the world, any more than it does for the Duke of Westminster, one of the richest people in the world, and one of the whitest from this photograph that I looked up this morning. It doesn't work that way. And so Professor Lefkowitz made the case. We know pretty much about the Ptolemies. We know pretty much about Cleopatra's ancestry. And she said it's a no-go. Then she went further and said some African Americans, in a desperate attempt to be somebody, were saying that the Greeks had learned everything from Egypt. And she especially was incensed that the students, black students at Wellesley, had invited Dr. Ben-Yochanan, an ardent Afrocentrist who said that the ancient Egyptians invented everything. They had invited Ben-Yochanan to campus, and she was furious. Professor Tony Martin at Wellesley was an ardent Afrocentrist, and there was a huge to-do on that campus. When I spoke on a panel, and I was respectful, and I had good relations with Professor Lefkowitz. I had even invited her to my campus to speak in my classes. On this particular night, it sort of devolved, though, with this position, well, the ancient Egyptians were anything but black, never defining what black was from the other side. And also that the idea that the Greeks had learned everything from the Egyptians was fatuous. First, they came much later. The idea of this ancient learning coming to Greece from Egypt was based on a 1954 work by a African-American teacher in Arkansas who consulted books that he found in a library, some of them dealing with kind of mysticism. And so she traced back and found out this his information, or the information in the book, and that it didn't go any further. These were sort of French Enlightenment ideas from someone who didn't know hieroglyphics, who had never been in Egypt. And so this was all a kind of myth. Now, Dr. Lefkowitz published a best-selling book. Americans bought her book, which was called Not Out of Africa. And it had a picture of Malcolm X on the front it had a picture of Herodotus, the father of Greek history, with a Malcolm X cap on his head, and the caption, Not Out of Africa. The book was a runaway bestseller, and it shows you the fleeting nature of bestsellerhood. I found that book in airports all over the world, wherever I went. I found it in London, I found it in Brazil, translated. It was an international bestseller. She had debunked the idea of a Black Egypt. Well, she had chipped away, really, at the ancestry of Cleopatra. And on that, she had hung a whole discussion, an entire discussion of who the ancient Egyptians were. So you get into this kind of game. Cleopatra wasn't Black, therefore the ancient Egyptians weren't Black. But my response was, well, Cleopatra was not ancient Egyptian. She's the end of a foreign dynasty. So we're sort of at a very high level. We're telling students and other people, we're juggling race. Race is one thing, it's another thing. And I agree with Du Bois, if we live in a country, the United States, is peculiar. It had the peculiar institution of slavery, which is not that peculiar, but what was peculiar was the determination of race. What I call the peculiar institution gave birth to the peculiar denomination. All right? So we could have blonde, blue-eyed Black people in the United States. It's not that hard to say the ancient Egyptians were Black because they had this one sub-Saharan drop. Because if we look and do DNA studies, they do. So we have a Black civilization. If you want to use the categories that you use here. In fact, and I'll stop here because these discussions are all situational. In 2008, I went to a conference in England at the University of Warwick, and it was on Afrocentrism. It was on Martin Bernal's book, Black Athena. And Professor Bernal was there, and a lot of people, most of the people were white, most of the people were from the English-speaking world. And so I drifted in. And what was interesting was the kind of closed shop nature of this discussion. There was a very polite discussion. And then I had with me a fairly large picture of Akhenaten, an ancient Egyptian pharaoh from around 1400 BC. And I said, this person, because this was 2008, and I said, this person looks to me very much like Barack Obama. Barack Obama could have been living in the New Kingdom in ancient Egypt. And so they looked at me as if I had two heads. Here was this crazy Afrocentrist, and he's saying that these people looked like this man. Well, Barack Obama doesn't look like a lot of Africans. And his mother was definitely not African. But in the United States, he was elected to great acclaim as being the first Black president. You can't, as Du Bois said, you can't keep switching the dial. You don't in the 21st century or even in the 20th century. You no longer have the power to switch the dial. Now you see it, now you don't. Now you see it, now you don't. Now you see it, now you don't. So I think we're talking about racial manipulation. Racial manipulation. And that we need to stop it. The ancient Egyptians were Black in the U.S. racial order. End of discussion. I think now it's time for questions.
Okay, so for the first question, I would like to know if you thought that the Netflix series was historically accurate.
No, I think that the Netflix series was highly inaccurate. It's trying to do something very good. It's trying to give us a glorious past. That is African Americans particularly, African American particularly. And so it is about as accurate, because it has the same aim, it's about as accurate as Wakanda, which is a film which some of you have seen, many of you have seen, so I don't need to explain Wakanda. And so it shows how it's in the sociology of knowledge, it's fantastic. Because what happens is, I often tell people, not just read the book, and we don't need fact checkers. I hate that phrase. You should know this. Before you go out and spend money on something, producing something, you should know this. You should know about Alexander and when he lived and what came after him and what happened to all the kingdoms founded by his successors, because they have in something like this. They fight the Romans, sometimes as an exchange, a marriage exchange, like with the Seleucids in what is now Iran and Syria. And the thing is that Greek kinglets ruled the Middle East. And so Cleopatra's not the only one. Okay? In Seleucia, now Iraq, there's someone reigning, speaking Greek, and he's not Iraqi and he's not Iranian. You can claim him, but he wasn't. They married other Greeks. This goes on all up to colonies of Greeks in what is now Pakistan. They intermarry. They have coins saying Phil Helenos, friend of the Greeks. And this goes on for hundreds of years until they die out. And they're sort of concerned with marrying each other. To say that these people are natives is just showing that you didn't do your homework. And if you do your homework, it's not hard to find the history of Egypt. Now, what happens is people are reacting to things that happened before they were born. In the early 1960s, Elizabeth Taylor was in a major film, and Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra. And that upset a lot of people. How could Cleopatra be Elizabeth Taylor? Well, the point is, it was a time of much more racism, but I'm going to say this directly to you. I didn't faint when I saw Cleopatra as Elizabeth Taylor, portrayed by Elizabeth Taylor. I wouldn't look, in a society like the United States, which is majority white society, it's not only Elizabeth Taylor, it's the actresses who portray a certain exoticism, who can play the role. And it's not, Elizabeth Taylor's not the first. There's Claudette Colbert, who plays in the 1930s Cleopatra. And before that, the Cleopatra in the movies was another fabrication, because the society is trying to get the goodies without getting the race. And the first Cleopatra was a woman called Theda Bara. And she said she was half French and half Arab, and that she had come to the United States to pursue her art. And in silent movies in 1915, she was Cleopatra. Now, not many people burned down theaters because Theda Bara was being Cleopatra. Black people had other concerns about the movies, like Birth of a Nation. So there wasn't much protest, but turned out that Theda Bara was a nice Jewish girl from Cincinnati whose real name was Theodosia Goodman. Everyone wants into the act. And so if a society like the United States, which is majority white right now, wants to say, okay, we have an actress to play this part. I mean, this was 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, and before. That doesn't shock me. That doesn't shock me. If the society wants to have a more accurate portrayal, it would have so-called people of color, and it would have people who in the United States are Black. Simple fact. A long time ago, Nick Cannon, the former husband of Mariah Carey, said, "We are sick of being fooled." Hollywood keeps giving us these mournful tales of slave degradation. If I say I want to produce a film in which white people are cannibalizing Blacks, because there is a theory, you can get it made more easily than you could have a film with a Black Nefertiti. more than you could have a film with a black Ramses. And I'm talking about an African American. I'm not talking about the color of their skin. I'm talking about their descent. Hollywood is not really, it's creepy to Hollywood. It talks about, as Lefkowitz said to me once, I'm not going to let them have our history, meaning the history of the West. You can have West Africa, you can have Central Africa, you can have all that, but you will not have the so-called high civilizations of the Nile Valley. This is what we're talking about underneath. This is what we're talking about. And my response is, the people in ancient Egypt look more like me than they do like you. So be quiet before you embarrass yourself. Well, I want to thank you all for seeing this video. I had forgotten that I had actually done, in early internet times, back in the 90s, an article on this and predicted that this would happen. Anyway, I want to thank Pedro, my editor and able assistant. I want to thank you for viewing, and I hope that you will comment. I hope that you will make your voices known, because someone once said I'm Teflon. I speak and people listen, but they don't respond angrily. I don't want angry response. Respond. Thank you so much for being here.